Greetings, fellow history enthusiasts. Welcome back to our channel, where we uncover the hidden stories that shaped our world. If you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. We dive deep into the most fascinating historical mysteries every week. Today, we're about to embark on an extraordinary journey. Imagine this. Beneath the bustling streets of modern Mexico City, archaeologists have just uncovered something that will rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Spanish conquest. They've found the buried palace of Moctezuma himself, lying directly beneath the house where Hernán Cortés once lived. But this isn't just another archaeological discovery. This is the revelation of one of history's most tragic acts of cultural erasure. What you're about to hear is the story of an unnamed Aztec noble who witnessed it all. The glory of Tenochtitlan, the arrival of the Conquistadors, and the systematic destruction of an entire civilization. This is his story, told in his own words. As he was forced to tear down his own sacred city, to build the conqueror's new capital directly on its ruins. But before we begin this incredible journey through time, make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this take months of research to bring to you. And please, let us know in the comments what other historical mysteries you'd like us to explore. Now, let's step back 500 years and witness the fall of an empire through the eyes of someone who lived it. Chapter 1. The Golden City. You think you know what happened here, but you've only heard their version. Let me tell you what really occurred in the city that floated on water. My name has been lost to time, buried beneath the stones of what you now call Mexico City. I was once a noble in the court of Moctezuma II, keeper of the sacred calendar, witness to the glory that was Tenochtitlan. When your archaeologists dig beneath the cathedral, when they find our palace rooms filled with offerings to gods you've forgotten, they are finding pieces of my life, fragments of a world that was more magnificent than anything your histories dare to admit. In the year you call 1519, our city was the largest in the world. Larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than any European capital your conquistadors had ever seen. 200,000 souls lived on our island, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways that seemed to walk on water. The Spanish, when they first saw it, thought they were dreaming. Some crossed themselves and whispered prayers, believing they had discovered the earthly paradise described in their holy books. I remember the morning light hitting the white limestone of our temples, how it made the entire city glow like a jewel set in the blue waters of Lake Texcoco. The great temple rose 150 feet into the sky, its twin shrines dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god, and Huitzilopochtli, our god of war and the sun. From its summit, you could see the entire valley, the mountains that cradled our world like the hands of sleeping giants. The palace where I served was a city within a city. Moctezuma's residence contained over 100 rooms, each designed for a specific purpose. There were chambers for receiving tribute from the far corners of our empire. Rooms where the finest artisans worked gold and silver into objects of impossible beauty, garden, where exotic birds from distant lands sang songs that reminded us of the vastness of our domain. In the palace aviaries, we kept over 300 species of birds: quetzals with their emerald feathers longer than a man's arm, scarlet macaws whose calls could be heard across the entire courtyard, hummingbirds so small they seemed like flying jewels, The Spanish later wrote that these birds ate more food in a day than 500 men, but they never understood that these creatures were not pets. They were living prayers, each species a messenger to different gods. The palace zoo housed jaguars, pumas, wolves, and serpents. We had pools filled with fish from both salt and fresh water, tended by men who knew the secret names of every creature. There was a section for human curiosities, too. Albinos, dwarfs, and hunchbacks, not displayed as freaks but honored as beings touched by the gods, each cared for with reverence and provided with their own servants. But it was the gardens that took my breath away every morning. Floating gardens called chinampas stretched across the lake, their geometric precision visible from the palace towers. These artificial islands, built from mud and vegetation, fed our entire population. The Spanish called them a miracle of engineering. But for us, they were simply home. We had turned a lake into farmland, created soil where none existed, made the water itself bear fruit. The markets of Tlatelolco, connected to our city by a short causeway, drew merchants from across Mesoamerica. On any given day, you could find goods from the Maya lands in the south, turquoise from the northern deserts, cacao beans that served as currency, and textiles so fine they seemed woven from clouds. The Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo later wrote that their markets surpassed those of Constantinople. But even his wonder-struck words could not capture the true magnificence of what we had built. I served in the palace as a keeper of the sacred calendar, responsible for calculating the movements of Venus and determining the most auspicious days for ceremonies. Our calendar was more accurate than anything the Europeans possessed. We had calculated the length of the year to within minutes of what your modern astronomers now know to be correct. We tracked eclipses, predicted the movements of planets, and understood that time itself moved in great cycles, each ending bringing both destruction and renewal. In the palace workshops, artisans created featherwork so intricate that each piece took years to complete. They would select individual feathers, sometimes just tiny portions of a single feather, and bind them to create images that seemed to glow with their own light. These weren't mere decorations. They were prayers made visible, stories told in plumage, histories written in the language of birds. The palace library contained thousands of codices, books made from bark paper and deer hide, covered with glyphs that recorded our history, our laws, our understanding of medicine and astronomy. Each book was a treasure, painted by scribes who spent their entire lives learning to capture knowledge in images. The Spanish would later burn almost all of these books, claiming they were the work of devils, destroying in days what had taken centuries to create. Moctezuma himself was a figure of almost divine authority. When he walked through the palace, nobles averted their eyes, for to look directly upon him was considered a grave offense. He ate from golden plates that were used only once before being given away or melted down. His clothing was changed 4 times daily, and he never wore the same garment twice. This wasn't vanity. It was the physical manifestation of his role as the earthly representative of the gods. The emperor's daily routine was governed by ritual and ceremony. He rose before dawn to perform private devotions, consulting with priests about the day's omens. He received reports from across the empire, delivered by runners who could cross vast distances in days, carrying messages encoded in knotted strings called quipu. Every decision, from the smallest administrative matter to declarations of war, was made in consultation with the calendar and the will of the gods. Our empire stretched from sea to sea, encompassing dozens of different peoples, each contributing their unique skills and resources to the greater whole. We were not merely conquerors, we were builders of civilization, creators of order from chaos. The tribute that flowed into Tenochtitlan wasn't just wealth. It was the lifeblood of a complex system that maintained peace and prosperity across a territory larger than Spain itself. In the evenings, I would often climb to the highest terraces of the palace and look out over our city. The canals reflected the light of thousands of torches, creating rivers of fire that seemed to flow through the darkness. The sound of drums from the temples mixed with the calls of night birds and the gentle lapping of waves against the stone foundations of our buildings. It was a sound like breathing, as if the city itself were a living creature, resting peacefully in the embrace of the lake. We believed our city would last forever. The prophecies spoke of cycles, of endings and beginnings. But Tenochtitlan seemed too magnificent, too perfectly adapted to its environment, too beloved by the gods to ever truly fall. We had survived floods, earthquakes, and wars. We had built our paradise on water, and water, we knew, was eternal. But in the year 13 Reed, which you call 1519, the omens began to change. Strange lights appeared in the sky. Temples burst into flames without cause, and the lake itself seemed to whisper warnings that only the priests could understand. We didn't know it then, but our world was about to end. Not in the gradual decline of empires, but in a catastrophe so complete that future generations would struggle to believe we had ever existed at all. Chapter 2. Omens in the Sky. The gods tried to warn us. If only we had understood their message before it was too late. 8 years before the Spanish arrived, the omens began. I remember the night when a comet appeared in the eastern sky, its tail stretching across the heavens like a wound in the darkness. It burned there for 40 days, visible even in daylight, and the priests declared it a sign that the fifth sun, our current age, was drawing to a close. Moctezuma called for the greatest astronomers in the empire to interpret this celestial message. They came from as far as the Maya lands, carrying their own calendars and prophecies. For days, they debated in the palace chambers, consulting ancient codices and performing complex calculations. Their conclusion was unanimous and terrifying. Great changes were coming. Changes that would transform the world beyond recognition. The emperor ordered increased offerings to the gods, hoping to appease whatever cosmic forces had been disturbed. The temples ran red with sacrifice, and the smoke from burning copal incense rose so thick it obscured the sun. But the omens continued. The temple of Huitzilopochtli caught fire spontaneously, its flames burning with an unnatural blue light that no amount of water could extinguish. The fire burned for 3 days before dying out on its own, leaving behind walls blackened but strangely unmarked. Then came the night when the lake itself seemed to boil. I was performing my evening observations from the palace observatory when I heard the commotion from the shores. The water was churning without wind, great bubbles rising to the surface and bursting with sounds like distant thunder. Fish floated dead by the thousands, their silver bodies carpeting the canals. The fishermen refused to go out for weeks, claiming they could hear voices calling from beneath the waves. The most disturbing omen came in the form of a bird, a crane caught by hunters in the marshes near Xochimilco. When they brought it to the palace, we saw that it bore on its head a mirror, perfectly round and polished, to an impossible shine. Moctezuma looked into this mirror and saw not his own reflection, but images of men riding upon deer, their bodies covered in metal that gleamed like water. The emperor cried out and turned away, but when he looked again, the mirror showed only darkness. Word came from the eastern provinces of strange sightings along the coast. Fishermen reported seeing mountains moving on the water, great structures that appeared and disappeared with the mist. Some claimed to have seen beings with pale skin and hair like dried grass. But these reports were dismissed as the fantasies of men who had spent too long in the sun. The priests began to speak more frequently of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the god-king who had ruled in the Golden Age before departing across the eastern sea with a promise to return. The prophecies said he would come back in the year Sayacatl, one reed, to reclaim his throne and establish a new age of peace and prosperity. But the prophecies also warned that his return would bring great upheaval, that the old world would have to die before the new one could be born. Moctezuma became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours in consultation with his personal priests and shamans. He ordered the construction of new temples and the expansion of existing ones, as if he could build walls high enough to keep out whatever forces were stirring in the cosmos. The palace workshops worked day and night, creating new offerings, crafting objects of such beauty and value that surely the gods would be pleased and the omens would cease. But the signs continued to multiply. Women began giving birth to children with strange markings, patterns on their skin that resembled the glyphs in ancient codices. Earthquakes shook the valley with increasing frequency, and the Great Pyramid of Teotihuacan, abandoned for centuries, was seen to glow with a pale light on moonless nights. The very stones seemed to be awakening from a long sleep. In the markets, people whispered of dreams that came to many on the same night. They dreamed of a great tree falling, its roots torn from the earth, its branches reaching toward a sky that was no longer blue but the color of blood. They dreamed of water turning to stone and stone turning to water, of birds that spoke in human voices and humans who could no longer speak at all. The emperor's sister, Papansin, fell into a death-like sleep that lasted for 4 days. When she awakened, she claimed to have visited the land of the dead and spoken with the ancestors. She said they were preparing to welcome a great multitude, that the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead were growing thin. She spoke of seeing great crosses of light and hearing the sound of bells that rang like no bells in our temples. I remember the morning when a delegation arrived from the coast, carrying news that would change everything. They had been sent by the governor of the eastern provinces, a man named Tendele, and they brought with them drawings made on bark paper. These drawings showed the floating mountains that had been sighted offshore. But now they could see that these were not mountains at all, but structures built by men, ships larger than any canoe, carrying beings who might be gods or might be something else entirely. The drawings showed these pale beings in detail. They had hair on their faces like the priests of certain gods, and their bodies were covered in what looked like the scales of silver fish. Some rode upon 4-legged creatures that resembled deer but were larger and more powerful. They carried long sticks that could kill from a distance, and they had with them animals unlike any in our lands. Creatures with 4 legs and no feathers, making sounds that were neither bird nor jaguar. Moctezuma studied these drawings for hours, comparing them to images in the ancient codices. The resemblance to certain depictions of Quetzalcoatl was unmistakable, But there were differences that troubled him. The god king of legend was described as bringing peace and wisdom, but these beings carried weapons and seemed prepared for war. Were they truly divine, or were they something else? Something the prophecies had not foreseen. The emperor ordered that gifts be prepared, the finest treasures in the palace storerooms. If these were indeed gods returning to reclaim their ancient dominion, they must be welcomed with appropriate honor. Gold worked into intricate patterns, feathers arranged in sacred designs, jade carved by masters who had spent lifetimes perfecting their art. All of this was gathered and prepared for transport to the coast. But even as we prepared these offerings, the omens continued to darken. The sacred fire in the temple of Huitzilopochtli, which had burned continuously for over a century, suddenly went out despite the constant attention of the priests. When they tried to relight it, the flames turned black and gave off no heat. The priests declared this the most ominous sign of all. The god of war was withdrawing his protection from the city. In the palace, strange accidents began to occur. Servants would find rooms filled with water despite no rain having fallen. Mirrors cracked without being touched, and the cracks formed patterns that looked like maps of unknown lands. The emperor's food tasters reported that even the finest delicacies had begun to taste of ashes, and the palace birds, usually so vocal, fell silent as if mourning something that had not yet died. I spent my nights on the observatory terraces, watching the stars and trying to read their message. The constellations seemed different, as if the very heavens were rearranging themselves for some cosmic event. Venus, the morning star sacred to Quetzalcoatl, appeared brighter than I had ever seen it, but its light was cold and distant, offering no comfort to those who sought guidance in its glow. The year Seacatl, one reed, was approaching, the year prophesied for Quetzalcoatl's return. As the date drew near, the entire empire seemed to hold its breath. Would the returning god bring the golden age promised in the ancient songs, or would his arrival herald the end of everything we had built? The omens suggested both possibilities, and perhaps that was their true message, that endings and beginnings are often the same thing, seen from different sides of time. None of us could have imagined that the pale beings approaching our shores would bring not divine wisdom, but human ambition, not spiritual renewal, but physical conquest. We prepared to welcome gods, and instead opened our doors to men whose hunger for gold would prove more destructive than any natural disaster, more final than any cosmic catastrophe. The omens had tried to warn us, but we had interpreted them through the lens of our own beliefs, never imagining that the end of our world would come not from the gods, but from other mortals who had simply learned different ways to kill. Chapter 3. The pale gods arrive. When we first saw them, we thought they were divine. How could we have known that gods could be so cruel? The year was Seacatl, one reed, which you call 1519. When the floating temples finally reached our shores, I was among the delegations sent by Moctezuma to greet what we believed were returning gods. The journey to the coast took us 3 days, traveling along roads that had carried tribute and trade for centuries, roads that would soon echo with the march of conquest. When we crested the final hill and saw the ocean, my breath caught in my throat. There, anchored in the bay, were 11 structures unlike anything in our world. They were larger than our greatest temples, yet they floated on the water like massive birds. Their wings were white as clouds billowing in the wind, and from their sides protruded long wooden arms that seemed to reach toward our land like grasping fingers. The beach was already crowded with local inhabitants who had come to witness this unprecedented sight. They knelt in the sand, offering prayers and flowers to what they too believed were divine visitors. The air was thick with copal incense, and the sound of conch shells echoed across the water, announcing to the gods that their people were ready to receive them. Then we saw the smaller boats approaching the shore, and in them the beings we had come to greet. My first sight of Hernán Cortés is burned into my memory like a brand. He stood in the prow of the lead boat, his armor catching the morning sun like polished obsidian. His beard was the color of dried blood, and his eyes were the pale blue of winter sky. When he stepped onto our sacred soil, the earth itself seemed to shudder. Behind him came his men, and with them came creatures that defied all understanding. Horses, though we had no word for them then, animals larger than deer, but bearing men on their backs, as if they were extensions of the riders themselves. The sound of their hooves on the beach stones was like thunder, and their breath steamed in the morning air like the exhalations of dragons. But it was the weapons that truly marked these beings as divine. They carried sticks that spoke with the voice of Tlaloc, the thunder god, producing smoke and fire and death from a distance. When they demonstrated their power by firing into the air, the sound rolled across the landscape like the roar of a jaguar magnified 100-fold. Birds fell dead from the sky, and the local people threw themselves face down in the sand, certain they were witnessing the power of creation itself. Cortés approached our delegation with what we interpreted as divine confidence. Through interpreters, first a Spanish priest who spoke some Maya, then a woman named Malintzin who would become his tongue in our language, he declared himself the servant of a great king across the water. But his manner suggested he was far more than any servant. He moved with the authority of one accustomed to absolute obedience, and his men watched him with the devotion usually reserved for gods. We presented the gifts Moctezuma had prepared. A disk of gold as large as a cartwheel, worked with the image of the sun, another of silver representing the moon, feather work of impossible intricacy, jade ornaments that had taken master craftsmen years to complete. The Spanish received these treasures with expressions we could not read. Was it divine pleasure or something else entirely? Cortés examined each gift carefully, weighing the gold in his hands, running his fingers over the smooth jade. When he spoke, his words were translated through the chain of interpreters, but even filtered through multiple languages, his meaning was clear. He was pleased with what he saw, but he wanted more, much more. He asked about the source of the gold, about the cities where such wealth was created, about the roads that led to the heart of our empire. The woman Malintzin fascinated and disturbed me in equal measure. She had been born among our people but had been sold into slavery among the Maya, and from them to the Spanish. Now she stood between two worlds, translating not just words but entire ways of understanding reality. When she spoke to Cortés, her voice carried the authority of one who had seen both sides of the great divide that was opening between our peoples. Through her, Cortés asked about Moctezuma, about the great city on the lake, about the empire that stretched from sea to sea. His questions were precise, military in their focus. He wanted to know about armies and fortifications, about the loyalty of subject peoples, about the routes that led to Tenochtitlan. These seemed strange concerns for a god, but we answered as best we could. still believing we were providing information to divine beings who had every right to know about their earthly domain. The Spanish made camp on the beach, and over the following days, we observed their habits and customs. They were unlike any gods in our pantheon. They ate meat without offering it first to the divine powers. They relieved themselves without the purification rituals required of mortals. And they showed no interest in the sacred calendar or the movement of the stars. Yet their power was undeniable. Their weapons, their horses, their great floating temples, all spoke of abilities beyond mortal understanding. More disturbing was their treatment of their own followers. The Spanish soldiers were clearly subordinate to Cortés and his captains, but they were not treated with the respect due to servants of gods. They were beaten for minor infractions, forced to perform menial labor, and fed simple rations while their leaders dined on the finest foods available. This hierarchy seemed more human than divine, more political than spiritual. Yet when they demonstrated their power, all doubts fled. I watched Cortés order a cannon fired at a nearby tree. The explosion was like the world splitting open. The sound so loud it seemed to come from inside my own skull. The tree, as a man's waist, was shattered to splinters, and the ground around it was scorched black. No mortal weapon could produce such destruction. Surely only gods could command the very forces of creation and destruction with such casual ease. The horses were equally miraculous. These creatures moved with a grace that seemed to defy their size, responding to their riders' slightest touch, as if they shared a single mind. When a Spanish cavalryman charged across the beach, his horse's hooves throwing up clouds of sand, the sound was like approaching thunder, and the sight was terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. Our own warriors, brave men who had never fled from jaguar or enemy spear, scattered before this divine cavalry like leaves before the wind. But it was the Spanish treatment of our sacred symbols that first suggested these might not be the benevolent gods we had expected. When local priests brought offerings to their camp, flowers, incense, small jade figurines, the Spanish showed no recognition of their sacred nature. Cortés ordered the figurines destroyed, claiming they were the work of demons, and he had a large wooden cross erected on the beach where our altar had stood. This cross was unlike any symbol in our religious tradition, where our sacred images were alive with color and movement, depicting the dynamic forces of creation. This cross was stark and simple, its meaning opaque to our understanding. When the Spanish knelt before it and made strange gestures, we tried to interpret this as a form of divine communication, but their rituals seemed cold and lifeless compared to our own ceremonies. Through Malintzin, Cortés began to ask more pointed questions about our religious practices. He seemed particularly interested in our sacrificial rituals, but his interest was not that of a god pleased with proper worship. It was the interest of someone seeking to find fault to justify some predetermined course of action. When we explained the necessity of offering blood to maintain the balance of the cosmos, his face darkened with what we would later recognize as righteous anger. The Spanish priest who accompanied the expedition was equally disturbing. Father Olmedo performed rituals over bread and wine, claiming to transform these simple substances into the flesh and blood of his God. This seemed like a form of sacrifice. But when we tried to participate in what we assumed was a divine communion, we were roughly pushed away. Their God, it seemed, was not interested in offerings from our people. As the days passed, more Spanish ships arrived, bringing additional men and supplies. The beach camp grew into a small city, with organized streets and defensive positions. This was not the temporary visit of divine beings checking on their earthly domain. This was the establishment of a permanent presence, a beachhead for something larger and more ominous. I began to notice details that troubled me. The Spanish were clearly mortal. They ate, slept, and performed bodily functions like any human. They fell ill from unfamiliar foods and suffered from insect bites and the heat. Some bore scars from old wounds, and I heard them speak of homes and families in distant lands. These were not the timeless, perfect beings of our religious imagination. They were men, albeit men with access to powers we could not understand. Yet even as doubt crept into my mind, I could not deny the evidence of their supernatural abilities. Their weapons spoke with the voice of thunder. Their horses carried them faster than the wind, and their great ships had crossed vast oceans to reach our shores. If they were not gods, they were something equally beyond our experience. Mortals who had somehow stolen divine power and turned it to their own purposes. The message I carried back to Moctezuma was confused and contradictory. I reported on the visitors' obvious power and their claim to divine authority. But I also noted their human weaknesses and their strange lack of interest in proper religious observance. The emperor would have to decide for himself whether these pale beings were the returning gods of prophecy or something else entirely, something for which our traditions had no name and our wisdom no preparation. Chapter 4. The Palace of Moctezuma. They marveled at our palace's splendor, but they saw only gold where we saw the sacred. They counted wealth where we housed the divine. When Cortés and his men first entered Tenochtitlan on the 8th day of the month of Quecoli, the entire city had been transformed into a stage for divine reception. Every street was swept clean, every building decorated with flowers and banners. The 3 great causeways that connected our island city to the mainland were lined with thousands of our people, all dressed in their finest clothing, all eager to witness the arrival of what they believed were returning gods. I walked beside Moctezuma's litter as we approached the causeway of Iztapalapa to greet our visitors. The emperor had dressed in his most sacred regalia, a cloak of quetzal feathers that seemed to capture and hold the morning light, a crown of gold and jade that had been worn by his predecessors for generations, sandals decorated with precious stones that clicked softly against the stone pavement with each step of his bearers. The Spanish approached on horseback, their armor gleaming, their weapons ready. Cortés rode at their head, and when he saw Moctezuma's procession, he dismounted and walked forward on foot, a gesture we interpreted as appropriate respect for divine authority. The 2 leaders met at the center of the causeway, with the lake stretching endlessly on both sides, and the great city rising before them like a vision from the realm of the gods. Moctezuma spoke the ritual words of welcome, addressing Cortés as the returning Quetzalcoatl, and offering him the throne that had been kept waiting for his return. Through Malincin's translation, Cortés accepted these honors with what seemed like divine grace, though I noticed his eyes were constantly moving, cataloging our defenses, counting our warriors, measuring the wealth that surrounded him on every side. The procession into the city was unlike anything our people had ever witnessed. The Spanish horses' hooves rang against the stone causeways like metallic thunder, and their riders sat tall in their saddles, looking down upon our people with expressions that mixed wonder and calculation. Behind them came foot soldiers carrying weapons we had never seen, their metal armor clanking with each step, their faces pale and bearded like the faces of gods from the ancient codices. But it was when we reached the palace that the true magnitude of our civilization became apparent to our visitors. The palace of Moctezuma covered an area larger than many European cities. Its buildings arranged around courtyards that could hold thousands of people. The walls were built of the finest stone, polished to a mirror shine and decorated with murals that told the history of our people from the beginning of the fifth sun to the present day. Cortés and his captains were housed in the palace of Axayacatl, Moctezuma's father, a building complex that was itself larger than most royal residences in Europe. The rooms were spacious and airy, with walls decorated in bright colors and floors covered with mats woven from the finest fibers. Each room had its own purpose: sleeping chambers, reception halls, private gardens, where the guests could walk among flowers that bloomed in careful arrangement according to the sacred calendar. I watched the Spanish explore their quarters with expressions of amazement that they tried to hide behind masks of divine indifference. They ran their hands along walls inlaid with precious stones, examined furniture carved from single pieces of rare wood, and tested the softness of sleeping mats stuffed with the down of exotic birds. Their wonder was genuine, but so was their hunger. I could see them calculating the value of everything they touched. The palace aviaries drew particular attention from our guests. We led them through galleries where hundreds of species of birds lived in spacious enclosures designed to replicate their natural habitats. There were pools for water birds, artificial trees for those that preferred the canopy, and special chambers where the most sacred species were kept. The quetzals, whose feathers were more valuable than gold, the hummingbirds that were believed to carry messages between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. Cortés asked detailed questions about the care and feeding of these birds, but his interest seemed practical rather than spiritual. He wanted to know how many servants were required, how much food was consumed, what the birds were worth in terms of trade value. The palace zoo was equally impressive to our visitors. We had collected animals from across our empire and beyond: jaguars from the southern jungles, wolves from the northern mountains, serpents whose venom could kill or cure depending on how it was prepared. There were pools filled with fish from both salt and fresh water, tended by specialists who knew the feeding habits and breeding cycles of each species. But it was the human inhabitants of the palace that seemed to disturb the Spanish most. We maintained quarters for people born with unusual characteristics: albinos, dwarfs, hunchbacks, and others marked by the gods with special signs. These individuals were not displayed as curiosities, but honored as beings touched by divine power, each provided with servants and treated with the respect due to those who carried messages from the supernatural realm. The Spanish priest, Father Olmedo, was particularly troubled by these arrangements. Through Malencine, he questioned the religious significance of caring for such individuals, suggesting that their conditions were punishments from his God rather than blessings from ours. This fundamental difference in understanding would prove to be one of many chasms between our worldviews that no amount of translation could bridge. The palace workshops were perhaps the most impressive demonstration of our civilization's achievements. In rooms dedicated to specific crafts, master artisans created objects of impossible beauty and complexity. Goldsmiths worked precious metals into intricate patterns that seemed to move and flow like living water. feather workers selected individual plumes and bound them into images so realistic they seemed ready to take flight. I accompanied Cortés through the goldsmith workshops, watching his reaction as craftsmen demonstrated their techniques. They could work gold into threads finer than hair, create alloys that produced colors ranging from deep red to pale yellow, and fashion objects so delicate they seemed to be made of captured sunlight. The Spanish leader's eyes grew bright as he watched, and he asked many questions about the sources of the raw materials and the time required to complete various projects. The palace library was another wonder that our guests struggled to comprehend. Thousands of codices lined the walls, each one painted by hand on bark paper or deer hide, containing the accumulated knowledge of our civilization. There were books of history, astronomy, medicine, law, and religion, their pages covered with glyphs that recorded information in a writing system more sophisticated than anything the Spanish had encountered in the New World. When we showed Cortés some of these books, explaining their contents through Malinson, his reaction was complex and troubling. He seemed impressed by the obvious sophistication of our writing system, but he also appeared suspicious of books he could not read, knowledge he could not control. He asked whether these codices contained information about gold mines, trade routes, and military strategies, practical concerns that missed the deeper spiritual and intellectual treasures contained in our libraries. The palace gardens were arranged according to principles that combined beauty with sacred geometry. Each plant was chosen not only for its appearance, but for its symbolic meaning and its relationship to the calendar and the movements of celestial bodies. There were sections devoted to medicinal herbs, areas where flowers bloomed in sequence to mark the passage of the seasons, and special groves where trees sacred to particular gods provided shade for contemplation and prayer. Moctezuma personally guided Cortés through these gardens, explaining the significance of various plants and their uses in ceremony and medicine. The emperor's knowledge was encyclopedic. He could identify hundreds of species, describe their properties, and relate their mythological associations. But I noticed that Cortés's attention wandered when the conversation turned to spiritual matters, focusing instead on plants that might have commercial value or military applications. The palace kitchens prepared feasts that showcased the diversity and sophistication of our cuisine. Dishes were prepared from ingredients gathered across the empire, fish from both oceans, game from mountain and jungle, fruits and vegetables cultivated in our floating gardens. The meals were served on plates of gold and silver, with each course presented according to ritual requirements that had been refined over centuries. Cortés and his men ate with obvious enjoyment, but they also showed a disturbing lack of understanding of the sacred aspects of the meal. They failed to make the proper offerings to the gods before eating. They mixed foods that should have been kept separate, according to religious law, and they showed no appreciation for the ceremonial significance of the serving vessels and utensils. As the days passed, I began to notice changes in the Spanish behavior that troubled me deeply. They explored the palace with increasing boldness, asking detailed questions about the location of treasure rooms and the security arrangements for valuable objects. They counted guards, measured distances, and made sketches of the palace layout with a thoroughness that seemed more military than divine. Most disturbing of all was their treatment of Moctezuma himself. While they maintained the outward forms of respect, I could see that they no longer regarded him as a divine ruler, but as a useful tool for controlling his people. They began making demands rather than requests, issuing orders rather than suggestions, and showing impatience when palace protocol required lengthy ceremonies and consultations. The palace that had been built to house the earthly representative of the gods was becoming a prison, its magnificent rooms transformed into cells, its sacred spaces violated by the presence of men who saw only material wealth where we had created spiritual treasure. The splendor that had taken generations to build was about to become the foundation for our own destruction, its very magnificence serving as both the motive and the means for the conquest that was already beginning, though we did not yet understand what we were witnessing. Chapter 5. The Feast of Deception. We prepared a celebration to honor our divine guests. Instead, we had invited wolves to feast among the lambs. The festival of Toxcatl was approaching, one of our most sacred celebrations, dedicated to Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, god of conflict and change. Moctezuma had decided that this would be the perfect occasion to demonstrate our devotion to what we still believed were returning gods. The irony of honoring the god of conflict in the presence of those who would bring ultimate conflict to our world was lost on us then, though it haunts me now in the darkness of memory. Preparations for the festival began weeks in advance. The entire city was transformed into a stage for divine theater. Artisans worked day and night, creating costumes of unprecedented magnificence, each feather placed with precision, each gold ornament polished to mirror brightness. The dancers who would perform the sacred rituals practiced their movements until they achieved the fluid perfection that would please both earthly and heavenly audiences. I was responsible for coordinating the astronomical aspects of the celebration, ensuring that each ceremony began at the precise moment when the celestial bodies were properly aligned. The festival would last for 20 days, with different rituals marking the passage of time according to our sacred calendar. Each day had its own significance, its own requirements, its own opportunities for the divine and mortal realms to intersect. Cortés expressed great interest in participating in the festival, though his questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of its spiritual significance. He wanted to know about the material aspects, the gold that would be displayed, the precious stones that would adorn the ceremonial costumes, the tribute that would be offered by visiting dignitaries from across the empire. When we tried to explain the religious meaning of these elements, his attention seemed to drift to more practical concerns. The Spanish had been in Tenochtitlan for several months by this time, and their behavior had grown increasingly troubling. They had begun making demands for gold, claiming that their distant king required tribute from all the lands they visited. They had also started questioning our religious practices more aggressively, with Father Olmedo declaring our ceremonies to be the work of demons and demanding that we abandon our ancient ways. But Moctezuma remained convinced that these were divine tests, that the pale gods were examining our faith and devotion before revealing their true nature and intentions. He ordered that the festival proceed with even greater magnificence than usual, hoping to demonstrate our worthiness to serve as earthly representatives of divine will. The emperor himself would participate in the ceremonies, dancing the ancient steps that connected our world to the realm of the gods. The main ceremony was to take place in the great courtyard of the temple complex, where thousands of participants would dance in intricate patterns that recreated the movements of celestial bodies. The dancers were nobles and priests, men and women who had spent years learning the sacred choreography, each step and gesture carrying deep spiritual meaning that connected the performers to the cosmic forces that governed all existence. On the morning of the principal ceremony, The city awakened to the sound of conch shells and drums echoing across the lake. The air was thick with copal incense, and flower petals carpeted the streets leading to the temple complex. Thousands of people had gathered from across the empire to witness this celebration, bringing gifts and offerings that would be presented to the gods through their earthly representatives. The Spanish had requested permission to observe the ceremonies from a position of honor near the main temple. Cortés claimed that his god was interested in learning about our religious practices, though he had shown little respect for our beliefs in previous encounters. We granted this request, believing that divine beings had every right to witness the worship offered by their earthly subjects. As the sun reached its zenith, the ceremonies began. The dancers entered the courtyard in a procession that had been refined over centuries, their costumes glittering in the bright light, their movements flowing like water given human form. The music was provided by drums, flutes, and rattles, creating rhythms that seemed to emerge from the heartbeat of the earth itself. I watched from my position near the astronomical observation platform, monitoring the shadows cast by the temple pyramids to ensure that each ritual began at the precisely correct moment. The dancers moved in patterns that recreated the cosmic dance of creation, their steps marking the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that governed all existence. It was beautiful beyond description, a perfect fusion of human artistry and divine inspiration. The Spanish observers seemed impressed by the spectacle, though I noticed they paid more attention to the gold and jade ornaments worn by the dancers than to the spiritual significance of their movements. Cortés stood with his captains, their hands resting on their weapons in a gesture that seemed more threatening than protective. Father Olmedo watched with obvious disapproval, his lips moving in what I assumed were prayers to his own god. The climax of the ceremony was approaching when the principal dancers, representing the gods themselves, would perform the most sacred movements in the center of the courtyard. These were the empire's highest nobles, men and women whose bloodlines connected them directly to the divine realm, wearing costumes that represented generations of artistic achievement and spiritual devotion. It was then that Cortés gave a signal that I did not understand at the time, but which has echoed in my nightmares ever since. His men, who had been positioned around the courtyard as honored observers, suddenly drew their weapons and moved to block all the exits. The change was so swift, so coordinated, that for a moment the dancers continued their movements, unaware that the sacred space had been transformed into a trap. The massacre began without warning, without provocation, without any justification that our minds could comprehend. Spanish soldiers rushed into the courtyard with swords and spears, cutting down dancers who had no weapons, no armor, no means of defense except their faith in the sanctity of the ceremony. The music stopped abruptly, replaced by screams of terror and the sound of metal cutting through flesh and bone. I watched in horror as men and women I had known since childhood fell beneath Spanish blades. These were not warriors but artists, not soldiers but priests, not enemies but celebrants whose only crime was participating in a religious ceremony that had been performed for centuries without harm to anyone. The blood of the innocent soaked into the sacred stones, defiling the temple complex in a way that no enemy army had ever managed to achieve. The Spanish showed no mercy, no discrimination, no recognition of the sacred nature of what they were destroying. They killed young and old, men and women, nobles and commoners with equal brutality. They stripped the bodies of their golden ornaments and jade jewelry, treating the sacred regalia as nothing more than plunder to be divided among themselves. Some of the dancers tried to flee, but the Spanish had positioned themselves to prevent any escape. They herded the survivors into corners of the courtyard where they could be killed more efficiently, their weapons rising and falling like the tools of butchers rather than the arms of warriors. The screams echoed off the temple walls, creating a sound like the world itself crying out in anguish. I remained frozen on my observation platform, unable to move, unable to comprehend what I was witnessing. These beings we had welcomed as gods were revealing themselves to be something far worse than mortal enemies. They were destroyers of the sacred, violators of the most fundamental laws that govern civilized behavior. No human army, no matter how barbarous, would have attacked unarmed participants in a religious ceremony. The massacre lasted perhaps an hour, though it felt like an eternity. When it was over, the courtyard was carpeted with bodies, the sacred stones slick with blood, the air thick with the smell of death. The Spanish moved among the corpses, stripping them of anything valuable, showing no more respect for the dead than they had shown for the living. Cortés stood in the center of the carnage, his armor splattered with blood, his face showing no emotion that I could recognize. When some of his men approached him with questions about what to do with the survivors who had hidden in the temple buildings, he gestured dismissively, as if the lives of our people were of no more consequence than insects to be swept away. News of the massacre spread through the city like wildfire. The people who had gathered to celebrate a sacred festival found themselves witnessing the destruction of everything they held dear. The rage that erupted was immediate and total. Thousands of warriors who had been held back by Moctezuma's orders to treat the Spanish as honored guests suddenly understood that these pale beings were not gods, but enemies of the most dangerous kind. The Spanish retreated to their quarters in the palace, but they were now surrounded by a city transformed from welcoming host to implacable enemy. The bridges connecting the island to the mainland were cut, trapping the conquistadors in the heart of a population that now understood the true nature of their visitors. The feast of deception was over, and the war for the survival of our civilization had begun. As I finally descended from my observation platform and walked through the courtyard filled with the bodies of my friends and colleagues, I realized that we had been fools to believe that gods could be so cruel. These were men, mortal men with mortal hungers and mortal hatreds. But they were men who had learned to use divine power for purposes that no god would ever approve. The festival that was meant to honor the sacred had become the moment when the sacred died, and with it, the world we had built on faith, beauty, and the belief that civilization could triumph over chaos. Chapter 6. Blood on Sacred Stones. The temple steps that had witnessed centuries of sacred ritual now ran red with the blood of innocents. Our gods had abandoned us. Or perhaps we had abandoned them. The aftermath of the massacre at the festival of Tenochtitlan transformed our city from a place of wonder into a battlefield. The Spanish had revealed their true nature, and our people responded with a fury that shook the very foundations of Tenochtitlan. The causeways that had welcomed divine visitors now bristled with warriors determined to drive out the destroyers of the sacred. The war that would determine the fate of our civilization had begun. I found myself trapped in the palace complex, along with the Spanish, not by choice but by circumstance. As one of Moctezuma's advisors, I was required to remain close to the emperor. Even though he had become little more than a prisoner of the men, he still insisted on treating as gods. The palace that had been a symbol of our civilization's greatness was now a fortress under siege. its beautiful courtyards transformed into defensive positions. Cortés had taken direct control of Moctezuma, using the emperor as a shield against the rage of our people. Through Malinzin's translation, he demanded that Moctezuma order the warriors to cease their attacks, to allow the Spanish to leave the city peacefully. But the emperor's authority had been shattered along with the sacred vessels in the temple courtyard. The people no longer listened to a ruler who had welcomed their destroyers and failed to protect the innocent. From the palace terraces, I could see the entire city mobilizing for war. Warriors emerged from every district, their obsidian-edged weapons glinting in the sunlight, their war paint transforming them into living embodiments of our god's anger. The canals filled with war canoes, their crews chanting battle songs that had not been heard in Tenochtitlan for generations. The very stones of the city seemed to cry out for vengeance. The Spanish had superior weapons, but they were vastly outnumbered and trapped on an island surrounded by hostile waters. Their horses, so terrifying in open country, were less effective in the narrow streets and canals of our city. Their cannons could destroy buildings, but they could not destroy the determination of a people fighting to defend their homes, their families, and their gods. The siege began with a rain of stones and arrows that darkened the sky above the palace. Our warriors had positioned themselves on the rooftops of surrounding buildings, turning every structure into a fortress from which they could attack the invaders. The Spanish responded with cannon fire that shattered ancient walls and sent fragments of carved stone flying like deadly rain. I watched from a palace window as Spanish soldiers tried to venture into the streets, only to be driven back by waves of warriors who seemed to emerge from the very stones of the city. Our people fought with a desperation born of religious fury, believing they were defending not just their lives, but the cosmic order itself. Every fallen Spanish soldier was seen as a blow struck against the forces of chaos and destruction. The Spanish had brought with them diseases that our people had never encountered, and these invisible enemies proved more deadly than any weapon. Warriors who had survived the initial fighting began falling ill with fevers and pustules that covered their bodies. Entire families were wiped out by plagues that spread through our population like fire through dry grass. The gods seemed to be punishing us, along with our enemies. Cortés grew increasingly desperate as the siege continued. He ordered Moctezuma to appear before the people and command them to cease their attacks. But when the emperor appeared on the palace balcony, he was greeted with stones and curses rather than obedience. Our people no longer recognized his authority. In their eyes, he had become a collaborator with the destroyers of the sacred, a traitor to his own people and gods. It was during one of these appearances that disaster struck. A stone thrown by an angry warrior struck Moctezuma in the head, and the emperor collapsed, blood flowing from a wound that would prove fatal. The Spanish claimed later that our people had killed their own ruler. But I knew the truth. Moctezuma died of a broken heart, as much as from his physical injuries, crushed by the realization that his attempts to serve as a bridge between two worlds had failed catastrophically. With Moctezuma's death, the last restraints on our warriors' fury were removed. The attacks on the palace intensified, with wave after wave of fighters throwing themselves against the Spanish defenses. The courtyards where we had once held peaceful ceremonies were now filled with the smoke of battle and the screams of the wounded. The beautiful gardens were trampled into mud mixed with blood from both sides. The Spanish began to run short of supplies. Their gunpowder was nearly exhausted, their food stores depleted, and their water supply cut off by warriors who controlled the aqueducts that brought fresh water to the palace. Some of the conquistadors spoke openly of surrender, but Cortés refused to consider defeat, driving his men forward with threats and promises of the wealth that awaited them if they could hold out until reinforcements arrived. But no reinforcements were coming. The Spanish ships in the harbor had been burned by our warriors, and the causeways remained firmly under our control. The invaders were trapped in the heart of our city, surrounded by a population that would accept nothing less than their complete destruction. For the first time since their arrival, the Spanish faced the possibility that their superior weapons might not be enough to ensure their survival. I witnessed scenes of incredible bravery from our warriors during those dark days. Young men who had never seen battle threw themselves against Spanish steel with nothing but obsidian clubs and the fury of the righteous. Women joined the fighting, hurling stones and boiling water from rooftops, turning every building into a fortress. Children carried messages between warrior bands, their small size allowing them to move through the city undetected by Spanish patrols. The Spanish, for their part, fought with the desperation of men who knew they faced not just defeat, but annihilation. They had seen what happened to their comrades who were captured, the ritual sacrifice that awaited those who had defiled our temples and murdered our priests. There would be no mercy for the destroyers of the sacred, no quarter given to those who had violated the most fundamental laws of civilized behavior. The palace itself began to show the effects of the prolonged siege. Walls that had stood for generations cracked under the impact of stones hurled by our warriors. Roofs collapsed under the weight of debris from Spanish cannon fire. The beautiful murals that had depicted our history were scarred by weapons and stained with blood from both sides of the conflict. In the midst of this chaos, I found myself serving as a reluctant intermediary between the Spanish and the few palace officials who remained alive. Cortés still hoped to find a peaceful solution, a way to extract his men from the city without admitting defeat. He offered to return the gold they had taken, to rebuild the temples they had damaged, even to leave hostages as guarantees of their good behavior. But our people were no longer interested in negotiations. The massacre at the festival had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, had violated trusts that could not be restored. The Spanish had revealed themselves to be not gods but demons, not divine visitors but destroyers of everything sacred and beautiful in our world. There could be no peace with such beings, no coexistence with those who had shown such contempt for the divine order. As the siege entered its second month, I began to see signs that our victory might come at a cost we had not anticipated. The diseases brought by the Spanish continued to spread through our population, killing warriors and civilians alike. The constant fighting had disrupted the agricultural cycles that fed our city, and food was becoming scarce. The very intensity of our resistance was beginning to weaken the foundations of our civilization. Yet our warriors fought on, driven by a fury that seemed to draw strength from the sacred stones themselves. They had seen their temples defiled, their priests murdered, their most sacred ceremonies turned into scenes of slaughter. They would accept nothing less than the complete expulsion of the invaders, even if it meant the destruction of the city they were fighting to defend. The blood that flowed on our sacred stones during those terrible days was not just the blood of battle. It was the lifeblood of our civilization, draining away with each passing day of conflict. We were winning the war, but losing something far more precious than military victory. We were losing the world we had built, the culture we had created, the connection to the divine that had made us more than just another collection of warriors and farmers. And in the depths of the palace, surrounded by the sounds of battle and the smell of death, I began to understand that this was not just a war between two peoples, but a collision between two entirely different ways of understanding reality. We fought to preserve the sacred. They fought to acquire the material. We died for our gods. They killed for their gold. The outcome of this conflict would determine not just who ruled our lands, but what kind of world would emerge from the ashes of our civilization. Chapter 7. The Night of Sorrows. They called it their Night of Sorrows. But for us, it was the night when the gods finally answered our prayers for vengeance. The night of the 30th of June, in the year you call 1520, would be remembered by the Spanish as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But for those of us who witnessed it from within the palace walls, it was the night when the cosmic balance finally shifted in our favor, when the gods of our ancestors rose up to reclaim their stolen city from the pale destroyers who had defiled our most sacred spaces. Cortés had finally accepted what his men had been telling him for weeks. They could not hold the palace indefinitely against the entire population of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish were running out of gunpowder. Their food supplies were nearly exhausted, and disease was claiming as many of his soldiers as our warriors' weapons. The decision was made to attempt a nighttime escape, hoping to reach the mainland under cover of darkness. I watched from a palace window as the Spanish prepared for their desperate flight. They had constructed a portable bridge from the timbers of their quarters, planning to use it to cross the gaps in the causeway where our warriors had destroyed the permanent bridges. The conquistadors loaded themselves down with as much gold as they could carry, their greed overcoming their military sense, even in this moment of mortal peril. The irony was not lost on me. These men who had come seeking gold would be destroyed by their lust for it. Many of the Spanish soldiers carried so much treasure that they could barely walk, let alone fight effectively. Their armor, which had protected them in battle, now became a burden that would drag them down into the dark waters of Lake Texcoco. The escape began at midnight, with the Spanish moving as quietly as possible through the palace courtyards toward the causeway of Tlacopan. They had chosen this route because it was the shortest path to the mainland, though it was also the most heavily defended by our warriors. Cortés led the advance guard, followed by the treasure-bearers and the wounded, with Pedro de Alvarado commanding the rear guard. For the first few hundred yards, it seemed their plan might succeed. The night was dark and rainy, providing cover for their movement, and our sentries had not yet detected their escape attempt. The Spanish moved like ghosts through the streets where they had once marched as conquerors, their footsteps muffled by the sound of rain on stone. But the gods were watching, and the gods were angry. A woman drawing water from a canal spotted the moving shadows and raised the alarm with a cry that pierced the night like an obsidian blade. Within moments, the entire city erupted in response. Conch shells sounded from every temple, drums thundered across the lake, and the war cries of 10,000 warriors shattered the silence of the night. The causeway became a killing ground. Our warriors emerged from the darkness like avenging spirits, their obsidian weapons gleaming in the light of torches that suddenly blazed from every building. War canoes appeared on both sides of the causeway, their crews raining arrows and spears down on the trapped Spanish column. The portable bridge that was supposed to ensure their escape became a bottleneck where they died by the dozens. I climbed to the highest terrace of the palace to witness the battle that would determine the fate of our world. From that vantage point, I could see the entire causeway stretching across the dark water, lit by the fires of battle and the torches of our warriors. The Spanish column was stretched out along the narrow stone road like a serpent being torn apart by eagles, each segment fighting desperately for survival. The treasure that the Spanish had been so eager to steal now became their doom. Soldiers weighted down with gold stumbled and fell into the lake, their armor dragging them down into the dark water where they drowned like stones. Others, trying to lighten their load, threw away fortunes in precious metals and gems, creating a trail of wealth along the causeway that would remain there for generations. Pedro de Alvarado, the man our people called Tonatiuh, the Sun, because of his golden hair and his cruelty, found himself trapped at the rear of the column, with the heaviest fighting raging around him. According to the stories that survived, he made an impossible leap across a gap in the causeway, using his spear as a pole vault to clear a distance that should have been beyond human capability. Whether this was divine intervention or desperate strength, I cannot say. But he was one of the few Spanish leaders to survive the night. The battle raged for hours, with our warriors showing no mercy to the invaders who had shown none to our people. The Spanish who were captured alive were taken to the temples for sacrifice, their hearts offered to the gods who had been so grievously offended by the massacre at the festival of Tenochtitlan. The screams of the dying echoed across the lake, a sound that our people heard as the music of divine justice. Cortés himself barely escaped with his life, reaching the mainland with only a handful of his original force. Most of his captains were dead, his artillery was lost in the lake, and his dreams of easy conquest lay shattered on the causeway stones. The man who had entered our city as a conqueror fled into the night as a broken fugitive, his army destroyed by the very people he had sought to enslave. But even as we celebrated our victory, I could see that the cost had been enormous. The causeway was choked with bodies from both sides, and the lake water was stained red with blood that would take days to wash away. Many of our own warriors had died in the fighting, and the diseases brought by the Spanish continued to spread through our population like an invisible army more deadly than any human force. The palace where I had served for so many years was now a ruin, its walls scarred by cannon fire, its courtyards filled with debris from the siege. The beautiful gardens where Moctezuma had walked in contemplation were trampled into mud, and the aviaries that had housed birds from across the empire stood empty, their inhabitants fled or dead. In the aftermath of the battle, our new emperor, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, ordered the city to be cleansed of all traces of Spanish presence. The crosses they had erected were torn down, the altars they had built were destroyed, and the quarters where they had lived were purified with fire and sacred smoke. It was as if we were trying to erase the memory of their presence, to return our city to its state of sacred purity. But the damage went deeper than physical destruction. The Spanish had brought with them ideas and diseases that could not be so easily removed. Our people had seen that the pale strangers were mortal, that they could be killed like any other men, but they had also seen the devastating power of European weapons and the ruthless efficiency of European military tactics. More troubling still was the knowledge that there were more Spanish ships on the ocean, more conquistadors who would come seeking the gold that had lured Cortés to our shores. The night of sorrows had been a victory, but it was not an ending. It was merely the first act in a longer tragedy that would ultimately consume our entire civilization. As I walked through the ruins of the palace in the days following the battle, I found myself thinking about the portable bridge the Spanish had built for their escape. It was a crude thing compared to our engineering marvels, but it represented something that troubled me deeply: the Spanish ability to adapt, to improvise, to find solutions to problems that would have stopped other peoples. They had been defeated, but they had not been destroyed. Somewhere on the mainland, Cortés was regrouping, planning his return, learning from his mistakes. He had seen the weakness in our defenses, the divisions among our subject peoples, the devastating effect of European diseases on our population. The Night of Sorrows had taught him lessons that would make his next attack far more dangerous than his first. The gods had given us victory, but at a price that was only beginning to become clear. Our city was damaged, our population weakened by disease, and our enemies were still alive and learning. The Night of Sorrows had been their defeat, but it had also been our warning, a glimpse of the greater catastrophe that was approaching like a storm on the horizon. In the quiet hours before dawn, as I stood among the ruins of what had once been the most beautiful city in the world, I began to understand that we had won a battle, but were losing a war we had never chosen to fight. The Night of Sorrows was ending, but the Age of Sorrow was just beginning, and it would continue until our entire world lay buried beneath the stones of a new civilization built on the bones of the old. Chapter 8. The Siege of Tenochtitlan. They returned like a plague of locusts, but this time they brought allies who had once been our subjects. The empire we had built became the weapon they used to destroy us. Cortés returned to the Valley of Mexico in the spring of 1521, but he was no longer the same man who had fled across the causeway during the Night of Sorrows. Defeat had taught him lessons that victory never could, and he had spent the intervening months transforming those lessons into a strategy that would prove devastatingly effective against our island city. The Spanish had built ships on the shores of Lake Texcoco, vessels designed specifically for warfare on our inland sea. These brigantines were unlike anything our people had ever encountered. Floating fortresses armed with cannons that could destroy our war canoes from distances our weapons could not reach. The lake that had been our greatest protection was about to become the highway for our destruction. But it was not the ships that posed the greatest threat to our survival. It was the army that marched with Cortés, an army composed largely of our former subjects who had chosen to ally themselves with our enemies. The Tlaxcalans, our ancient rivals, had joined the Spanish cause, bringing with them thousands of warriors who knew our tactics, our weaknesses, and our fears. From my position in the palace, now serving the new Emperor Cuauhtémoc, who had succeeded his uncle Cuitlahuac after the latter died of the Spanish plague, I watched the enemy forces take position around our city. They established camps on the mainland, cutting off our access to fresh water and supplies. The causeways that connected us to the outside world became battlegrounds where our warriors fought desperately to keep the supply lines open. The siege began in earnest on the 10th day of May, 1521, with a coordinated attack from land and water that demonstrated the Spanish had learned from their previous defeat. The brigantines swept across the lake like predatory birds, their cannons destroying our war canoes, and their crews slaughtering our warriors with weapons that killed from impossible distances. On land, the Spanish and their indigenous allies advanced along all three causeways simultaneously, forcing us to divide our defenders and fight on multiple fronts. They had learned to fill in the gaps they created in the causeways as they advanced, preventing us from cutting their retreat routes as we had done during their first invasion. The fighting was more brutal than anything our city had ever experienced. This was not the ritualized warfare of our traditions, where battles were fought for captives and tribute, but a war of extermination where the Spanish sought to destroy not just our military forces but our entire way of life. They showed no mercy to civilians, no respect for sacred spaces, no recognition of the laws that had governed warfare among civilized peoples for centuries. Day by day, the Spanish advanced deeper into our city, destroying everything in their path. They tore down the houses of nobles and commoners alike, using the stones to fill in the canals and create solid ground for their horses and artillery. The beautiful city that had taken centuries to build was being systematically demolished, its very foundations torn up and repurposed for the convenience of our enemies. The aqueducts that brought fresh water to our city were among the first targets of the Spanish assault. Within days of the siege beginning, our people were forced to drink the brackish water of the lake, water that had been contaminated by the bodies of the dead and the waste of war. Disease spread rapidly through our population, weakening our defenders and killing our civilians faster than enemy weapons. Food became increasingly scarce as the siege continued. The floating gardens that had fed our population were destroyed by the Spanish brigantines, their careful cultivation ruined by the passage of warships and the debris of battle. The markets that had once displayed the wealth of an empire stood empty, their stalls abandoned, their merchants fled or dead. Our warriors fought with incredible bravery, but they were facing enemies who had advantages that no amount of courage could overcome. Spanish steel cut through our cotton armor, Spanish horses trampled our foot soldiers, and Spanish cannons reduced our fortifications to rubble. Most devastating of all were the diseases that continued to ravage our population, invisible enemies that killed more effectively than any army. I watched from the palace terraces as entire districts of our city fell to the Spanish advance. The methodical destruction was horrifying to witness. Buildings that had stood for generations were reduced to rubble in hours. Canals that had carried trade and tribute for centuries were filled with stones and corpses. Temples that had housed the gods for time immemorial were torn down, and their sacred stones used to build Spanish fortifications. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical assault. The Spanish made sure that the smoke from burning temples was visible throughout the city, that the screams of captured warriors being sacrificed to their alien god could be heard in every district. They wanted our people to know that their gods were powerless, their priests helpless, their entire cosmology nothing more than superstition in the face of European steel and gunpowder. Emperor Cuauhtémoc proved to be a worthy successor to his predecessors, leading the defense with a combination of tactical skill and personal courage that inspired our warriors to fight beyond their physical limits. He was everywhere at once, commanding from the palace, leading charges against Spanish positions, organizing the evacuation of civilians from the most dangerous areas of the city. But even his leadership could not overcome the fundamental imbalance in the conflict. The Spanish had superior weapons, better armor, more effective tactics, and most importantly, they had allies who knew our weaknesses and were willing to exploit them. The Tlaxcalans and other indigenous groups who had joined the Spanish cause fought with the fury of people settling old scores, showing no mercy to their former overlords. As the siege entered its third month, the city began to show signs of imminent collapse. Entire districts had been abandoned to the Spanish advance, their populations either dead, fled, or huddled in the few remaining strongholds around the temple complex. The great market of Tlatelolco, once the commercial heart of our empire, was now a battlefield where our warriors made their last desperate stands. The smell of death hung over the city like a physical presence. Bodies lay unburied in the streets, victims of disease, starvation, and Spanish weapons. The canals that had once carried fresh water and trade goods now flowed with blood and debris. The birds that had filled our aviaries were long dead, and even the fish in the lake had been poisoned by the contamination of war. In the palace, we could hear the Spanish cannons getting closer each day, their thunderous voices announcing the destruction of another temple, another palace, another piece of our civilization. The walls that had protected our rulers for generations were cracking under the impact of European artillery, and we knew that our final stronghold would soon fall. The end came with shocking suddenness. On the 13th day of August, 1521, Spanish forces broke through our last defenses and poured into the temple complex where we had made our final stand. Emperor Cuauhtémoc was captured while trying to escape by canoe. And with his capture, the last organized resistance collapsed. I was among those taken prisoner in the final assault. My status as a palace official, saving me from immediate execution but condemning me to witness the systematic destruction of everything I had spent my life serving. The Spanish showed no interest in preserving the architectural marvels they had conquered. Their only concern was extracting the maximum amount of wealth from the ruins of our civilization. The siege of Tenochtitlan had lasted 75 days, but its effects would last forever. The city that had been the jewel of the New World was now a field of rubble and corpses, its population dead or scattered, its temples destroyed, its palaces looted. The empire that had stretched from sea to sea was finished, its subject peoples now free to settle their grievances against their former masters. But the Spanish were not content with military victory. They wanted to erase every trace of our civilization, to build their new world directly on the foundations of the old. And for that task, they would need workers who knew the secrets of our construction, who could tear down our temples stone by stone and use those same stones to build the churches and palaces of New Spain. They would need people like me, people who had helped build our paradise, and would now be forced to destroy it with their own hands. Chapter 9. Tearing Down Paradise. They made us destroy our own temples, stone by stone. Each block we removed was a piece of our souls. Each wall we demolished was a prayer silenced forever. The Spanish wasted no time in beginning the systematic destruction of Tenochtitlan. Within days of the city's fall, Cortés had organized work gangs of surviving inhabitants to begin tearing down the temples and palaces that had taken centuries to build. I found myself assigned to one of these gangs, my knowledge of the palace construction making me valuable to the conquerors who needed to understand how our buildings were assembled before they could efficiently dismantle them. The irony was bitter beyond description. I had spent my life helping to create the most beautiful city in the world, calculating the astronomical alignments of temples, supervising the placement of stones according to sacred geometry, ensuring that every structure harmonized with the cosmic order. Now I was being forced to undo that work, to reduce divine architecture to mere building materials for Spanish churches and government buildings. The Spanish approach to demolition was as methodical as their approach to conquest. They began with the Great Temple, the heart of our religious life, the axis around which our entire cosmology revolved. Teams of workers were assigned to different sections of the pyramid, each group responsible for removing the stones in a specific order that would prevent the structure from collapsing catastrophically and damaging the valuable materials within. I watched with tears in my eyes as the twin shrines at the temple's summit were dismantled piece by piece. These sacred spaces, where our priests had communed with the gods for generations, were reduced to piles of carved stone that would be repurposed for Spanish construction projects. The altar where Huitzilopochtli had received offerings was broken up, and its fragments used to build the foundation of a Christian church. The Spanish showed no understanding of the sacred significance of what they were destroying. To them, our temples were simply collections of valuable building materials, our sculptures nothing more than decorative elements that could be incorporated into their own architectural projects. They had no comprehension of the centuries of spiritual development that had gone into creating these structures, no appreciation for the cosmic principles that had guided their construction. The palace complex where I had served presented particular challenges for the demolition crews. The buildings were interconnected in complex ways, with load-bearing walls that supported multiple structures and underground chambers that had to be carefully emptied before the buildings above them could be safely demolished. My knowledge of these hidden connections made me indispensable to the Spanish engineers who were planning the destruction. Each day brought new horrors as familiar spaces were transformed into construction sites. The throne room where I had witnessed Moctezuma receive tribute from across the empire was gutted, its golden decorations stripped away, and its carved walls reduced to rubble. The library where thousands of codices had preserved our accumulated knowledge was emptied, its precious books burned as fuel for the lime kilns that processed stone for Spanish mortar. The gardens that had been Moctezuma's pride were among the first casualties of the reconstruction. The Spanish had no interest in preserving the carefully balanced ecosystems that had taken decades to establish. The exotic plants were uprooted, the artificial streams filled in, and the entire area leveled to create space for European-style buildings with their rigid geometric layouts. The aviaries that had housed birds from across our empire were dismantled with particular brutality. The Spanish saw no value in creatures that could not be eaten or sold, and the elaborate structures that had provided homes for hundreds of species were torn down without ceremony. The few birds that survived the conquest were released to fend for themselves in an environment that had been transformed beyond recognition. But it was the destruction of the astronomical observation platforms that affected me most personally. These structures, which I had helped design and maintain, had allowed our priests to track the movements of celestial bodies with incredible precision. The Spanish demolished them without understanding their purpose, treating sophisticated scientific instruments as nothing more than pagan monuments that needed to be eliminated. The Spanish brought in their own architects and engineers to oversee the construction of their new city, but they relied heavily on our knowledge and skills to make their plans reality. We knew the properties of local stone, the techniques for working in the challenging environment of the lake, the methods for creating foundations that would remain stable in the soft soil of our island. Cortés had grand plans for his new capital. He wanted to create a city that would rival the great capitals of Europe, a monument to Spanish power and Christian civilization that would erase all memory of the pagan empire that had preceded it. The layout he envisioned followed European principles, with a central plaza surrounded by government buildings and a cathedral. Straight streets arranged in a grid pattern, and residential districts organized according to Spanish social hierarchies. The central plaza was to be built directly over the ruins of our temple complex, a deliberate act of symbolic domination that would place Christian worship literally on top of our destroyed religious center. The cathedral would rise where the great temple had stood, its bells calling the faithful to prayer from the same spot where conch shells had once announced ceremonies to our gods. The palace that would house the Spanish viceroy was planned for the site where Moctezuma's residence had stood. This was not coincidence, but calculated symbolism. The Spanish wanted to demonstrate that their authority had replaced ours, that their civilization had triumphed completely over our own. Every stone from our palace that went into their building was a declaration of conquest, a permanent reminder of our defeat. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Many of our people died in accidents as massive stones shifted unexpectedly, or structures collapsed without warning. The Spanish showed little concern for worker safety, viewing our lives as expendable resources to be used up in service of their grand construction projects. Those who were injured and could no longer work were simply abandoned to fend for themselves. The diseases that had devastated our population during the siege continued to take their toll among the work gangs. Men who had survived the conquest succumbed to European plagues, their bodies weakened by poor food, exhausting labor, and the psychological trauma of being forced to destroy their own cultural heritage. The Spanish replaced the dead workers with new captives brought in from outlying areas, treating human beings like interchangeable tools. As the demolition progressed, I began to hide small objects and artifacts in places where I hoped they might survive the destruction. A jade figurine tucked into a crack between stones, a fragment of a codex wrapped in waterproof materials and concealed in an underground chamber, pieces of our heritage that might someday be discovered by future generations who would want to understand what had been lost. The Spanish were so focused on extracting wealth and building their new city that they paid little attention to these small acts of preservation. They were interested in gold and silver, in precious stones and valuable materials that could be shipped back to Spain. The cultural artifacts that meant everything to us were worthless to them, making it possible to save at least some remnants of our civilization. The most heartbreaking moments came when we uncovered burial chambers and sacred deposits that had been hidden within the temple structures. These contained offerings that had been placed there during construction ceremonies, objects that connected the buildings to the spiritual realm and ensured divine protection for those who worshipped within them. The Spanish ordered these items destroyed or melted down, severing the spiritual connections that had made our architecture more than mere construction. Month by month, the familiar skyline of Tenochtitlan disappeared. The pyramids that had dominated the horizon for centuries were reduced to ground level, their stones carted away to build Spanish structures. The palaces that had housed our rulers were demolished and replaced with European-style buildings that bore no resemblance to our architectural tradition. The canals that had given our city its unique character were filled in to create streets suitable for horses and wheeled vehicles. The Spanish had no appreciation for the engineering marvel that had allowed us to build a great city on water, no understanding of the delicate balance between human habitation and natural environment that our ancestors had achieved through centuries of careful planning. As I worked day after day, tearing down the paradise my people had created, I began to understand that this was more than physical destruction. It was cultural genocide, the systematic elimination of everything that had made us who we were. The Spanish were not content to rule over us. They wanted to transform us into something else entirely, to erase our memories and replace our dreams with their own. But even as I participated in this destruction, I held on to the hope that someday someone would dig beneath the Spanish city and discover the truth about what had been buried there. I imagined future archaeologists uncovering the foundations of our temples, finding the artifacts I had hidden, piecing together the story of a civilization that had been deliberately erased from history. In that hope, I found the strength to continue, knowing that every stone I helped remove was also a stone that might someday bear witness to the greatness that had been destroyed. Chapter 10. Buried Beneath the New World. Now you have found us. 500 years later, you have dug through their lies and discovered our truth. This is why I buried our memories in stone, so that you would know what really happened here. The work of destruction and reconstruction took nearly a decade to complete. By the time the Spanish had finished building their new capital on the ruins of our city, almost nothing remained visible of the civilization that had once flourished here. The great cathedral rose where our temple had stood, its bells calling Christians to prayer from the same spot where our priests had once communed with the gods. The viceroy's palace occupied the site of Moctezuma's residence, its European architecture a deliberate erasure of our architectural traditions. But beneath the Spanish city, in hidden chambers and forgotten foundations, lay the truth of what had been destroyed. I had spent those years of forced labor not just tearing down our temples, but also concealing evidence of our greatness in places where I hoped it would survive until someone came looking for it. Every artifact I hid, every fragment I preserved, was a message to the future, a testament to the civilization that had been buried beneath the conqueror's stones. The Spanish built their houses directly on top of our palace foundations, never suspecting that beneath their floors lay chambers filled with the treasures they had overlooked in their haste to extract obvious wealth. They were so focused on gold and silver that they ignored the jade carvings, the obsidian mirrors, the featherwork, and the codices that represented the true treasures of our culture. I remember the day when Cortés himself came to inspect the construction of his new residence. He walked through rooms that had been built with stones from Moctezuma's throne room, stood on floors that covered the burial places of Aztec emperors, looked out windows that framed views of a lake that had been drained to make way for Spanish agriculture. He had no idea that he was living literally on top of the civilization he had destroyed. The irony was perfect and terrible. The man who had conquered our empire, who had ordered the destruction of our temples and the burning of our books, was sleeping above the very chambers where our greatest treasures lay hidden. His bedroom was directly over the room where Moctezuma had kept his most sacred regalia. His dining hall covered the library where our most important codices had been stored. As the years passed and the Spanish city grew and prospered, our buried civilization became a secret known only to a few surviving workers who had participated in the construction. Most of these men died without passing on their knowledge, taking to their graves the locations of hidden chambers and concealed artifacts. But I lived longer than most, and I made sure that at least some of the secrets would survive. I trained my son, born to a woman who had survived the conquest, in the old ways of reading the stars and understanding the sacred calendar. I taught him the locations of the hidden chambers, the meaning of the symbols carved in concealed places, the stories that connected our buried treasures to the living culture that had created them. Through him, the knowledge passed to his children, and through them to their descendants, a chain of memory that stretched across the centuries. The Spanish tried to erase our history, to make it seem as if their civilization had always existed in this place. They wrote new histories that portrayed us as savages who had been civilized by European contact, that minimized our achievements and exaggerated our flaws. They wanted the world to believe that nothing of value had been lost when our empire fell, that the conquest had been a blessing rather than a catastrophe. But the stones remember, the foundations we laid, the chambers we built, the artifacts we hid. All of these bear witness to the truth of what existed here before the Spanish came. Every carved glyph tells a story of sophisticated knowledge. Every hidden treasure speaks of artistic achievement. Every concealed chamber proves that a great civilization once flourished where Mexico City now stands. I lived to see the Spanish city grow into a colonial capital that rivaled the European cities from which its builders had come. Streets were laid out in perfect grids. Churches rose on every corner, and palaces housed Spanish nobles who had never seen the civilization they had displaced. The new inhabitants had no idea that they were walking on the graves of emperors, that their foundations rested on the ruins of temples, that their gardens grew in soil enriched by the ashes of burned libraries. The lake that had cradled our island city was gradually drained and filled, transforming the aquatic environment that had shaped our entire way of life. The Spanish could not understand how to live with water as we had learned to do over centuries of adaptation. They saw the lake as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a resource to be cherished, and they systematically destroyed the ecological balance that had sustained our civilization. As I grew old, I often walked through the Spanish city, seeing with my aged eyes the ghostly outlines of the buildings that had once stood there. I could navigate the new streets by remembering the old canals, could locate important sites by their relationship to buried temples, could read the palimpsest of two civilizations written one on top of the other in stone and memory. The Spanish built their cathedral with particular care, wanting to create a monument that would demonstrate the triumph of Christianity over what they called paganism, but they built it directly over our most sacred space. And I knew that someday, when their cathedral crumbled or was demolished, archaeologists would discover the temple foundations beneath and understand the true significance of this site. I died in the year you call 1568. Nearly 50 years after the conquest, having lived long enough to see the Spanish city become established and prosperous. But I died knowing that our story was not finished, that the truth we had buried would someday be uncovered by people who would understand its significance and honor the civilization that had been lost. And now, 5 centuries later, you have found us. Your archaeologists have dug through the layers of Spanish construction and discovered the palace rooms where I once served, the chambers where we hid our treasures, the foundations that supported our temples. You have found the artifacts I concealed, the codices I preserved, the evidence I left for you to discover. When you excavate beneath the cathedral, you find the stones of our great temple. When you dig under the government buildings, you uncover the foundations of our palaces. When you explore the basements of colonial houses, you discover the chambers where we lived and worked and worshipped. Every excavation reveals more evidence of the sophisticated civilization that existed here before the conquest. The house where Cortés lived, built directly on top of Moctezuma's palace, has become an archaeological site where visitors can see both civilizations at once. The Spanish colonial architecture above the Aztec imperial foundations below. It is a perfect metaphor for the relationship between our two worlds, one built literally on top of the other. The conqueror's city rising from the ruins of the conquered. But now you know the truth. You understand that we were not the savages described in Spanish histories, but the builders of one of the world's great civilizations. You can see the sophistication of our architecture, the beauty of our art, the complexity of our knowledge. You can read our glyphs and understand our stories, appreciate our achievements, and mourn our losses. The recent discovery of palace rooms beneath Mexico City is just the beginning. There are more chambers waiting to be found, more artifacts hidden in forgotten places, more stories buried beneath the streets of the modern city. Each excavation brings you closer to understanding the full scope of what was lost when our empire fell. The magnitude of the cultural catastrophe that occurred here 500 years ago. I buried our memories in stone so that you would find them. I hid our treasures in secret places so that you would discover them. I preserved our stories in hidden chambers so that you would understand them. Everything you are uncovering now was placed there deliberately, a message from the past to the future, a testament to the resilience of truth and the persistence of memory. We built a new world on the bones of the old, but we also buried the old world beneath the new, waiting for the day when someone would dig deep enough to find it. That day has come. You have found our buried palace, and with it, you have found us. We are no longer lost to history. We are part of it again. Our voices speaking from the stones, our stories written in the artifacts you uncover, our civilization restored to its rightful place in the human story. This is why I lived, why I remembered, why I hid our treasures and preserved our truth, so that someday someone like you would find us and understand what really happened here. The conquest destroyed our bodies, but it could not destroy our spirits. We live on in every stone you uncover, every artifact you discover, every story you tell about the civilization that once flourished where Mexico City now stands. We built a new world on our people's bones, but we also ensured that our bones would someday tell their own story to those who cared enough to listen. Remember us. Honor us. Tell our story. That is all we ever ask. And now, 500 years later, you are finally able to give us what we sought: recognition, understanding, and a place in the memory of the world. The buried palace you have found is more than an archaeological discovery. It is the resurrection of a civilization, the return of a people who were never truly gone, only hidden beneath the stones of those who thought they had erased us forever.